They found him in pieces, a fragmented skull broken into multiple sections, a jawbone with teeth still embedded, ankle and shin bones scattered in the dark, waterlogged earth of a Danish peat bog, and beside his shattered remains, lying in the mud as if it had just been placed there yesterday, the weapon that killed him, a wooden club, made of maple, still intact after more than 5,000 years, preserved by the same acidic conditions that had protected his bones from complete dissolution. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a burial that went wrong. This wasn't a body disposed of in haste. The fractures on his skull told a story of deliberate, methodical violence, at least 8 heavy blows to the head, each one calculated, each one crushing, each one delivered with significant force, each one aimed with precision, each one ensuring that there would be no survival, no escape, no mercy. The forensic evidence was unmistakable. Someone, or multiple someones, had beaten this man to death with systematic brutality. And then they had carried his body to a bog, a sacred wetland, a liminal space between earth and water, between the human world and the realm of the gods. They had placed him there deliberately, along with ceremonial objects, a ceramic vessel, cow bones. These weren't random items discarded in a panic. These were offerings. This was ritual. This was sacrifice. For over a century, he lay in museum storage, just another set of bones recovered by peat cutters in 1915 from a bog near the village of Vittrup in northern Denmark. Workers digging for fuel had uncovered the remains at the bottom of their trench and contacted the local museum. The bones were collected, catalogued, dated approximately based on the artifacts found with them, and then largely forgotten. A curiosity, a fragment of the past with no story attached, one more ancient skeleton among thousands in Denmark's archaeological collections. But in 2024, everything changed. Scientists used cutting-edge forensic technology to reconstruct not just how he died, but how he lived. And what they discovered was extraordinary. What they uncovered was unprecedented. What they revealed was a complete biography spanning decades, crossing hundreds of miles, bridging 2 completely different cultures, and ending in violence that still echoes across 5 millennia. This man travelled hundreds of miles across the frigid, dangerous waters of the Scandinavian peninsula. He left behind his entire culture, his native language, his way of life, everything he had ever known. He transformed from a maritime hunter-gatherer of the frozen north, someone who lived entirely from the bounty of the sea, into a farmer in a foreign land where people lived completely different lives. He survived for decades, possibly 20 years or more, in a society that was fundamentally different from everything he had experienced in his childhood and adolescence. He ate different food, learned different skills, spoke a different language, participated in different rituals, understood the world through a different cultural lens. He bridged 2 worlds that were separated not just by geography, but by thousands of years of divergent human development. He was living proof that these cultures, despite their profound differences, could and did interact. That individuals could cross these boundaries. That adaptation was possible even when the cultural gap seemed impossibly wide. And then, sometime between 3300 and 3100 BC, when he was between 30 and 40 years old, someone decided he had to die, and they made certain of it. The violence was extreme, systematic, unmistakable in its intent. This was not an accident. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a fight that escalated. This was not a crime of passion where someone lost control in a moment of anger. The forensic analysis of his skull fragments, conducted by modern osteologists using techniques that can reconstruct ancient trauma with remarkable precision, reveals the methodical nature of his murder. At least 8 blows to the head, heavy impacts delivered with significant force. Each strike was aimed at the skull, the most lethal target on the human body. Each blow was delivered with a blunt object that had a rounded surface, creating oval-shaped fracture patterns that forensic specialists can read like a book. The maple wood club found beside his remains is almost certainly the murder weapon. Its size and shape match the fracture patterns perfectly. Its presence in the bog, deliberately placed alongside the body, confirmed that this was not a weapon casually discarded, but a ritual object with meaning. 8 blows minimum. Think about what that means. The first blow, if delivered with sufficient force to the skull, would likely have rendered him unconscious, possibly killed him outright. But someone kept hitting. Again, and again, and again. At least 8 times, maybe more. The fragmented state of the skull makes it impossible to count every impact with certainty, but 8 can be definitively identified from the fracture patterns. This level of violence suggests something beyond simple murder. This is overkill. This is making absolutely certain. This is ritualized violence with meaning beyond the mere ending of a life. And yet, there are no defensive wounds on his other bones. His arms show no fractures consistent with trying to block blows. His hands show no damage from attempting to grab the club or fend off his attacker. The bones of his forearms, which would typically show defensive injuries if he had raised them to protect his head, are uninjured. This absence of defensive wounds suggests several possibilities, each disturbing in its own way. He may have been restrained, held down by multiple people while someone delivered the blows. This would require cooperation, organization, multiple participants. This would make the murder a community event rather than the act of one individual. Or he may have been unconscious from the very first blow. If the initial strike caught him by surprise, if he never saw it coming, if he was immediately knocked unconscious, there would be no defensive wounds. He would have no opportunity to fight back. He would simply collapse, and the subsequent blows would be delivered to a body that was already unconscious or dying. Or, most disturbing, he may have been willing. Some sacrificial victims in ancient cultures accepted their fate. They believed they were being sent to serve the gods. They saw their death as an honor, a sacred duty. If Vittrup Man had been convinced that his sacrifice was necessary, that the community needed him to die for the favor of the gods, for good harvests, for protection from disaster, he might not have resisted. He might have submitted to the violence, believing it had meaning. We cannot know which scenario is true, but all 3 require the same conclusion. This was not a spontaneous murder. This was planned. This was organized. This involved multiple people. This was ritual. After he was killed, after the systematic beating that ensured no possibility of survival, his body was transported to the bog. Not the edge of the bog, not a convenient spot for quick disposal, but into the wetland itself, to a location that had clearly been used for ritual purposes before. The cow bones found with him weren't remains of a meal, they were offerings. The ceramic vessel wasn't discarded trash, it was a ritual object. These items were deliberately chosen and deliberately placed. The club itself was left with the body, the murder weapon as part of the offering. This is significant. In a simple murder, you would hide or destroy the weapon. In a ritual sacrifice, the weapon has meaning. It's part of the ceremony. It represents the act. It connects the killer, the victim, and the gods. The location itself was significant. Wetlands held a special place in the religious life of Northern Europe during this period. For thousands of years from the Neolithic through the Iron Age, people deposited valuable objects in bogs. We have found thousands of artifacts in Danish wetlands. Bronze weapons, gold jewellery, tools, pottery, agricultural implements. These weren't items lost by accident. These were deliberate offerings to powers believed to dwell in or control the bogs. The bogs themselves were seen as liminal spaces, places where the solid earth gave way to water, where walking became treacherous, where the familiar became strange, where methane gas could spontaneously combust, creating mysterious lights that ancient people might have interpreted as signs from the gods, where bodies sank and were preserved, perhaps suggesting to ancient observers that the bog was a portal to another realm, a place where death didn't lead to normal decomposition, but to some other state of being. So Vittrup Man's body was carried to this sacred, liminal space, placed there with ceremony, accompanied by offerings. The act was witnessed, the act was public, the act had meaning within the cultural and religious framework of the community. But why? Why him? After years or decades of living in this community, after all that time adapting to their ways, eating their food, participating in their world, why was he chosen for this violent end? This is the question that haunts researchers. This is the mystery that even the most advanced forensic technology cannot fully answer. We can reconstruct the what and the how with remarkable precision, but the why remains elusive. Theory 1. He was a slave, and when he was no longer useful, he was sacrificed. This is the interpretation favoured by Christian Christiansen, one of the lead archaeologists on the research team. He suggests that Vittrup Man may have been captured during a raid on hunter-gatherer communities in the north. Such raids are documented in the archaeological record. Conflict between farming and hunter-gatherer societies occurred. People were taken captive. And what happens to captives in societies that don't have prisons or formal systems of incarceration? They become slaves. If Vittrup Man was brought to Denmark as a captive, perhaps as a teenager or young adult, he might have been forced to work in the demanding labour of early agriculture. Clearing fields, planting crops, harvesting grain, tending animals. This was back-breaking work. Work that would wear down even young, strong bodies. And if he was never fully integrated into the community, if he remained always an outsider, always marked by his appearance and his origins as different, he would have no one to protect him. No family ties, no social bonds that would make his death create obligations or demands for revenge. When he reached middle age, when his body was worn out from decades of hard labour, when he could no longer work as efficiently as before, he would become a burden, a mouth to feed with no economic return. And in a society operating at the margins of subsistence, where failed harvests meant starvation, economic calculations about human life were harsh. But a used-up slave could still serve one final purpose. His death could sanctify the bog. His body could be an offering to the gods. His sacrifice could buy divine favour for the community. His worthless life could become valuable in death. This is brutal logic, but it's logic that many slave-owning societies throughout history have applied. Theory 2. He was a trader or merchant who was killed in a dispute or as part of a conflict. The flint axes from Denmark found in Norway didn't transport themselves. Someone was facilitating this trade, someone who could travel between communities, who understood both cultures, who could negotiate exchanges. Thomas Booth, a bioarchaeologist at the Francis Crick Institute in London, favours this interpretation. Perhaps Vittrup Man was chosen when he came of age to serve as a merchant. Perhaps his entire adult life was dedicated to maintaining trading relationships between Danish farmers and Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. Perhaps he travelled back and forth, bringing Danish flint north and bringing northern materials south. This would explain why he left his community as a young adult. This would explain why he learned to eat farming food. This would explain why he spent so much time in Denmark. But perhaps something went wrong. Perhaps a trade deal failed. Perhaps he was accused of cheating or stealing. Perhaps he was caught in a larger conflict between groups. Perhaps he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when tensions boiled over into violence. His foreign status, his position as an intermediary between groups, would make him vulnerable. He would have no strong kin group to avenge him. His death wouldn't trigger blood feuds. He could be killed without social consequences. And if his death occurred during a time of crisis, during a crop failure or disease outbreak or drought, the community might have reinterpreted his killing as necessary sacrifice. What began as murder could be retroactively given religious meaning by depositing the body in the sacred bog with proper ritual. Theory 3. He transgressed some cultural boundary that we don't understand. Ancient societies had taboos, rules, behaviours that were absolutely forbidden. Breaking these taboos could result in death, especially if the transgression was seen as threatening the cosmic order or angering the gods. Perhaps Vittrup Man, as an outsider never fully socialised into Danish farming culture, violated some fundamental rule. Perhaps he ate food that was forbidden. Perhaps he entered a sacred space where foreigners weren't allowed. Perhaps he had a sexual relationship that violated cultural norms. Perhaps he refused to participate in some required ritual. Perhaps he spoke words that couldn't be unsaid. We will never know what taboos existed in Neolithic Danish society. We don't have their laws written down. We don't have their stories. We don't have their religious texts. We can only infer from archaeological evidence and from comparisons with other ancient societies. But we know that all human societies have boundaries that cannot be crossed. And we know that violations of sacred boundaries have often been punished by death. If Vittrup Man violated such a boundary, his execution would have been seen as necessary, not personal, not about revenge or hatred, but about maintaining social and cosmic order, about appeasing the gods, about protecting the community from divine anger. His death would have been ritual, not despite the violence, but because of it. The violence would be necessary. The violence would have meaning. The violence would restore balance. Theory 4, he was chosen specifically because he was an outsider. Many ancient societies practiced human sacrifice, and many chose victims from marginal social categories: slaves, foreigners, criminals, people who didn't have strong social ties, people whose death wouldn't tear apart the social fabric of the community. If the Danish farming community needed a human sacrifice, if their religious calendar demanded it, if a crisis required appeasement of the gods, Vittrup Man would be an ideal victim. He was an adult male, physically strong, suitable for sacrifice, but he was also an outsider. His death would not create blood feuds within the community. His family, if they were still alive in distant Scandinavia, would never know what happened to him. He could be killed without social cost. This is cold logic, but it's logic that appears in many sacrificial systems throughout human history. The victim must be valuable enough to be a real gift to the gods, but not so integrated into the community that their death creates unmanageable social disruption. The perfect victim occupies this liminal space, valuable but expendable, human but other, important enough to matter to the gods, but not important enough to matter to the community. Vittrup Man, with his decades of residence but his permanent mark of otherness, with his working body but his lack of kinship ties, with his foreign origins but his local knowledge, occupied exactly this liminal space. He was perfect for sacrifice in the worst possible way. Each of these theories has evidence to support it. Each fits some aspects of what we know, but none can be proven with certainty. The truth may involve elements of multiple theories, or the truth may be something we haven't even considered, something outside our modern framework of understanding, something that made perfect sense to people in 3300 BC but is alien to us. What we can say with certainty is that his death was violent, ritualized, and deliberate, that multiple people were involved, that the community sanctioned or participated in his killing, that his body was treated as a sacred offering rather than as trash to be hidden, that the bog was the appropriate place for his remains according to the religious beliefs of the time. And we can say that whatever the reason for his death, it was connected to his status as an outsider. Whether he was slave or trader, whether he transgressed or was simply expendable, his foreign origin was central to his fate. The same qualities that made his life remarkable, his cross-cultural journey, his adaptation, his survival in a foreign land, these same qualities may have made his death inevitable. The peat bogs of northern Denmark have kept secrets for thousands of years. These wetlands, with their oxygen-starved waters and highly acidic soil, create perfect conditions for a very specific kind of preservation. Bodies that sink into these bogs don't decompose the way they would in normal earth. Instead, something remarkable happens, something that seems almost impossible. The peat begins a natural mummification process that can last for millennia. The chemistry is fascinating. Peat bogs are highly acidic, typically with pH levels between 3 and 4, similar to vinegar. This acidity comes from the accumulation of sphagnum moss, another organic matter that doesn't fully decompose. The environment is also cold and waterlogged, with very little oxygen. Bacteria that normally break down organic tissue can't survive in these conditions. Without bacterial action, without oxygen, without warmth, the normal processes of decay simply stop. But something else happens. The acidic water contains tannins, the same compounds found in tea and wine. These tannins essentially tan the skin, turning it dark brown or black, preserving it like leather. The soft tissues, organs, hair, fingernails, skin, all of these remain intact in ways that would be impossible in normal burial conditions. The stomach contents can survive. The fingerprints can still be visible. Even facial expressions can be preserved with shocking clarity. However, there's a trade-off. The acidic water that preserves soft tissue simultaneously dissolves bone. The calcium phosphate that gives bones their hardness simply dissolves away in the acidic environment. What's left are bones that are soft, pliable, often incomplete. In many bog bodies, the skeleton has completely disappeared, leaving only the preserved soft tissue. In others, like Vittrup Man, the conditions were just right to preserve bones while destroying soft tissue. The result is a spectrum of preservation, from perfect mummies to mere skeletons, depending on the specific chemistry of each individual bog. Northern Europeans have known about bog bodies for centuries. During peat cutting operations, which were essential for fuel in regions where wood was scarce, workers would occasionally unearth these preserved remains. The discoveries were often shocking. These bodies didn't look ancient, they looked recent, fresh even. Workers would sometimes flee in terror, believing they had stumbled upon a recent murder victim. Others would report the findings to local authorities, triggering investigations into murders that had occurred thousands of years earlier. In the 18th and 19th centuries, before modern archaeology, many bog bodies were simply removed and given Christian burials. People assumed they were recent deaths, perhaps victims of crime or accident from a few years or decades before. The idea that these could be ancient people preserved for millennia seemed impossible. It was only with the rise of scientific archaeology in the 20th century that researchers began to understand what they were really finding. And what they found was extraordinary. Hundreds of bog bodies have been discovered across Northern Europe. In Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, and Britain, these preserved remains have emerged from wetlands, each one a snapshot of ancient life, frozen at the moment of death, each one telling a story, each one raising questions. The most famous of these bog bodies is Neolithic Man, discovered in a bog on the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark in May 1950. His preservation was so perfect that he looked as if he had died hours before, rather than over 2,000 years before. His face was peaceful, serene almost. His eyes were closed, his lips were slightly parted. The rope that had been used to hang him was still around his neck, knotted on the side, the noose clearly visible. He wore a pointed leather cap. His stubble was still visible on his chin. He looked so alive that the workers who found him immediately called the police, convinced they had discovered a recent murder victim. When archaeologists examined Neolithic Man, they found his last meal preserved in his stomach, porridge made from barley, flax seeds, and various wild plants. No meat. This was a meal deliberately chosen, perhaps ritually significant. The rope around his neck and the peaceful expression suggested he had been hanged, possibly as a sacrifice. Carbon dating eventually placed his death around 400 BC, during the pre-Roman Iron Age. He had been lying in that bog for 2,400 years, waiting to be found. Then there was Neolithic Man, found in 1952 in a bog near the village of Graubal, also in Denmark. His preservation was equally remarkable, though his death had been more violent. His throat had been cut from ear to ear. The wound was so well preserved that forensic pathologists could determine the type of blade used and the direction of the cut. Like Vittrup Man, his last meal was identifiable, a porridge of grains and seeds. His hands and fingers were perfectly preserved, showing that he had never done heavy manual labour. His fingerprints were still visible. Modern forensic analysts have been able to create detailed reconstructions of his face. He had died around 290 BC, during the same cultural period as Vittrup Man. Man from Britain, discovered in 1984 in a peat bog in Cheshire, showed evidence of even more extreme violence. He had been hit on the head twice with a blunt object. His neck had been broken, a cord had been tightened around his neck, and his throat had been cut. This was overkill in the truest sense, 3 or even 4 different methods of execution performed on the same individual. Researchers call this triple death, or overkill, and they believe it had ritual significance, perhaps offering the victim to multiple gods, perhaps ensuring absolute certainty of death before the ritual deposition. His body dated to around 2 BC to 119 AD, the Roman period in Britain. These bodies and hundreds of others paint a picture of a widespread cultural practice that spanned thousands of years. From the Neolithic period through the Iron Age and even into the Middle Ages, northern European cultures placed bodies in bogs. The evidence suggests these weren't random burials or desperate attempts to hide murder victims. These were deliberate, ritualized depositions. Bodies were placed in specific locations within bogs. They were often accompanied by objects, animal bones, pottery, tools. The placement was careful, the ritual was important. But why? Why would cultures across northern Europe, spanning thousands of years, engage in this practice? What did the bogs represent to these ancient people? Archaeologists and historians have developed several theories based on the physical evidence and on ancient written accounts. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in 98 AD, described Germanic tribes performing ritual sacrifices in sacred groves and wetlands. He wrote about individuals being drowned in bogs as punishment for cowardice or sexual transgressions. He described slaves being ritually drowned after washing cult statues of the goddess Nerthus. These accounts, though written by an outsider and possibly influenced by Roman prejudice, suggest that bog sacrifice was indeed a recognized cultural practice. The bogs themselves seem to have held deep religious and cultural significance. They were liminal spaces existing between categories. Not quite land, not quite water. Places where the solid earth gave way to liquid, where walking became treacherous, where the familiar became strange. In many ancient cultures, such liminal spaces were seen as portals to other worlds, gateways to the realm of the gods, boundaries where the barrier between the human world and the supernatural realm grew thin. Bogs also had practical importance. They provided peat for fuel. They were hunting grounds for waterfowl. They yielded bog iron, which could be smelted into tools and weapons. They produced moss that could be used for various purposes. These were not wastelands, but valuable resources that communities depended on. Perhaps offerings had to be made to ensure continued access to these resources. Perhaps the gods of the bogs demanded tribute. The pattern of bog depositions suggests ritual rather than simple disposal. Valuable objects were placed in bogs alongside bodies. Bronze neck rings, gold bracelets, weapons, pottery, agricultural tools. These were not items you would casually throw away. These were significant gifts, sacrifices to accompany human sacrifices. The bogs became repositories of wealth, of lives, of offerings to powers that ancient people believed controlled their fate. Many of the bog bodies show signs of violent death: hanging, throat cutting, blunt force trauma, strangulation, stabbing. These were not natural deaths. These were executions, and the age profile is telling. A disproportionate number of bog bodies are young adults, people in their late teens to early 30s. This age pattern doesn't match what you would expect from natural deaths or accidents. It suggests selection. Someone was choosing who would be placed in the bogs. Some researchers believe these were criminals, people executed for transgressing social norms. Others argue they were sacrificial victims, chosen for their physical perfection to serve as gifts to the gods. Still others suggest they might have been slaves or captives, people whose deaths would not create social disruption within the community. The truth is probably that all of these explanations are correct for different individuals. Over thousands of years, many different people ended up in bogs for many different reasons. But one thing is clear. This was not casual. This was not random. The careful placement, the accompanying objects, the ritualized violence, all of this points to a deliberate cultural practice with deep meaning for the societies that engaged in it. The bogs were sacred. The deaths were significant. The depositions were ritual acts that connected the living community to forces they believed controlled life, death, fertility, and fate. And this was the world that Vittrup Man entered. Not just a different geographical location, not just a different economy or language, but a completely different religious and cultural framework. A world where bogs were sacred, where human sacrifice was an accepted practice, where violence could have ritual meaning, where death in a wetland could be seen as a gift to the gods, rather than a crime against humanity. For nearly 100 years, these bones sat in Denmark's National Museum, a skull fractured into pieces, a jawbone, an ankle, a shin bone, a wooden club, a ceramic pot. These were catalogued as artifacts from around 3800 to 3500 BC and largely forgotten. But bones can tell stories if you know how to read them. And modern science has learned to read bones in ways that would have seemed like magic just a few decades ago. In 2014, researchers in Denmark launched an ambitious project to sequence the genomes of hundreds of ancient skeletons from prehistoric Denmark. They wanted to understand the genetic history of the region, how populations moved, how they mixed, how farming cultures from the Middle East gradually replaced or merged with indigenous hunter-gatherer societies. They included Vittrup Man in this study, expecting him to match the genetic profile of other Neolithic farmers who lived in Denmark around the same time. But when the results came back, something was wrong. His DNA didn't match at all. Vittrup Man was genetically distinct from every other skeleton in the study from the same time period. His closest genetic relatives weren't the farming communities of Denmark. They were the hunter-gatherer populations living hundreds of miles away in what is now Norway and Sweden. People who still lived the old ways, people who hadn't adopted agriculture, people who still hunted and fished as their ancestors had done for thousands of years. This was unexpected. This was fascinating. This demanded further investigation. Anders Fischer, a researcher at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, who had spent 40 years studying Stone Age cultures, assembled a team to conduct the most detailed life history analysis ever attempted on a Neolithic skeleton. They would use every tool available to modern bioarchaeology: genetic analysis, isotopic testing, protein sequencing, dietary reconstruction. They would map not just where Vittrup Man came from, but how he lived every stage of his life, from childhood to death. What they discovered was unprecedented. They could trace his geographical movements with precision. They could identify the exact types of food he ate at different ages. They could watch his entire life unfold through the chemical signatures locked in his bones and teeth. And what they saw was a life of dramatic transformation. The isotopes in human teeth record everything. Every sip of water, every bite of food, every change in location. Strontium isotopes, which vary by geology, can pinpoint where someone spent their childhood. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes reveal diet. Oxygen isotopes indicate climate and water sources. These chemical signatures get locked into tooth enamel during development and remain unchanged for life, creating a permanent record of early years. Vittrup Man's tooth enamel told a story of a childhood spent in the far north. The strontium levels didn't match anything in Denmark. They pointed to the coastal regions of the Scandinavian peninsula, possibly as far north as the Arctic Circle. This was a region of fjords and frozen shores, of long winters and short summers, of people who lived entirely from the sea and the hunt. The protein analysis of his dental tartar was even more specific. Tartar, that hard calcified plaque that builds up on teeth, traps microscopic food particles. Modern technology can identify these proteins with extraordinary precision, and in Vittrup Man's tartar, researchers found proteins from cod, sea bream, seal meat, whale meat, and dolphin. This was the diet of a maritime hunter-gatherer, someone who lived on the bounty of cold northern seas. But here's where the story gets interesting. The carbon and nitrogen isotopes in his teeth, which form layers as teeth develop, showed a dramatic shift. During his childhood and early adolescence, his diet was almost entirely marine. Fish, sea mammals, the signature of a coastal hunter-gatherer culture. But sometime around age 18 or 19, everything changed. The isotopes shifted. Suddenly, his diet included terrestrial foods, freshwater fish, wild game, and then, in his early adulthood, another shift: cereals, dairy products, sheep meat, goat meat. This was the diet of a farming community, the diet of Neolithic Denmark, where agriculture had been established for several generations. Vittrup Man had left the world of hunters and entered the world of farmers. To understand how extraordinary this transformation was, we need to understand what Europe looked like 5,000 years ago. We need to grasp the magnitude of the cultural divide that Vittrup Man crossed. We need to see the world as it existed in 3300 BC, a world so different from our own that it requires imagination to fully comprehend. This was a continent in the middle of one of the most profound transitions in human history. For thousands and thousands of years, for time periods so long that they dwarf all of recorded civilization, all of Europe had been inhabited exclusively by hunter-gatherer societies. These were the descendants of the people who had painted the magnificent cave art at Lascaux and Chauvet, who had survived the brutal conditions of the Ice Age, adapting to landscapes dominated by glaciers and tundra, who had developed increasingly sophisticated tools, weapons, art and social structures, while living entirely off wild resources, who had spread across the continent following herds of animals and seasonal plant resources, who had built cultures and societies that were complex, sophisticated, and successful by any measure. For tens of thousands of years, this was the only way humans lived in Europe. Hunting wild animals, gathering wild plants, fishing rivers and seas, moving with the seasons, living in small bands of extended families, understanding the world through oral traditions and ritual practices that left few traces in the archaeological record. These people were not primitive in any meaningful sense. They had deep knowledge of their environments. They created art. They buried their dead with ceremony. They had language, culture, social structures, religion, all the elements that define humanity. But around 7000 BC, something new arrived in southeastern Europe: farming, agriculture, the deliberate cultivation of plants and domestication of animals. These innovations had been developed over thousands of years in the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent region that included modern Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and the Levant. There, around 1000 BC, people had begun experimenting with cultivating wild grains and herding wild sheep and goats. Gradually, generation by generation, they had created domesticated varieties of wheat, barley, peas, lentils, and other crops. They had selectively bred sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle, until these animals were fundamentally different from their wild ancestors. And this new economy, this new way of life, had revolutionary implications. Farming allowed for permanent settlements. You couldn't farm if you were constantly moving. You had to stay in one place to plant, tend, and harvest crops. You had to build structures to store grain. You had to defend your fields from both animals and other humans. Permanent villages emerged, then towns, then eventually cities. Farming also allowed for much higher population densities. A field of wheat could feed far more people than the same area of wild landscape. Children were no longer a burden during migrations, but assets who could help with agricultural labour. Birth rates increased. Death rates in good years decreased. Populations grew, and grew, and grew. But farming also created new social structures. Stored grain was wealth. Some families accumulated more than others. Inequality emerged. Social hierarchies developed. Craft specialists appeared. People who made pottery or tools but didn't farm themselves, supported by the surplus that farming created. Religious specialists, political leaders, warriors, all these roles became possible when farming produced enough surplus to support them, and these farming populations began to move. Slowly, generation by generation, spreading westward and northward, from the Middle East into Europe. They brought their crops and animals with them. They brought their languages and religions and social structures. They brought their genes. Modern DNA analysis shows that these early European farmers had Middle Eastern ancestry, distinct from the indigenous European hunter-gatherers. As they spread across Europe, they encountered the existing hunter-gatherer populations. What happened in these encounters varied by time and place. Sometimes there was conflict, sometimes there was trade, sometimes there was intermarriage. The genetic evidence shows mixing, but also shows that in many regions, the farming populations largely replaced the hunter-gatherers. Not through genocide necessarily, but through sheer demographic weight. Farmers had more children. Their populations grew faster. Over generations, they simply outnumbered the indigenous people. By 3300 BC, when Vittrup Man was alive, this transition was well advanced in southern and central Europe, but it was still ongoing in northern Europe. Denmark had been transformed. The farming communities who settled there, whom archaeologists call the funnel beaker culture after their distinctive pottery, had arrived from the south, bringing Middle Eastern-derived agriculture. They had cleared forests, they had planted fields of wheat and barley, they had built permanent wooden houses, some of them quite large. They had created villages. They had constructed elaborate burial chambers, megalithic tombs that required community organisation and significant labour to build. These were sophisticated societies. They made beautiful pottery, decorated with geometric patterns. They created flint axes and daggers of remarkably high quality, tools that were traded across vast distances. They had social hierarchies, specialised roles, organised religion. They sacrificed animals and humans in their sacred bogs. They buried their elite dead with rich grave goods. They were successful, growing in numbers and expanding their territory. But farther north, in what is now Norway and Sweden, the old ways persisted. The cold climate of Scandinavia made farming more difficult. The growing season was short. The soils in many areas were poor. The existing resources from hunting and fishing were abundant. Northern Scandinavian hunter-gatherer communities continued to thrive using technologies and strategies that their ancestors had developed over thousands of years. They fished the rich coastal waters for cod, sea bream, and other species. They hunted seals and small whales. They gathered shellfish. They hunted terrestrial game. They moved seasonally to exploit different resources. They built sophisticated boats capable of ocean voyages. They had their own art, their own rituals, their own social structures. They were the direct descendants of the Mesolithic people who had lived in northern Europe since the end of the Ice Age. They were Vittrup Man's people. The genetic evidence shows that these northern hunter-gatherers and the southern farmers were visibly different. The hunters had darker skin, lighter eyes, and different facial features. The farmers had lighter skin and darker eyes. If Vittrup Man walked into a Danish farming village, everyone would immediately see that he was an outsider. His appearance alone would mark him as different, as other, as not one of us. But these two populations were not completely isolated. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of contact. Those high-quality Danish flint axes have been found in Norway, far beyond the northern limit of farming. Materials from northern Scandinavia, like certain types of stone, have been found in Denmark. There was trade, there was exchange. These cultures knew about each other. But knowing about each other and living with each other are very different things. The cultural gap was enormous. Hunter-gatherers and farmers had fundamentally different worldviews, different economic systems, different social structures, different religious beliefs, different languages, almost certainly. Different understandings of property, of kinship, of time, of the relationship between humans and nature. For a hunter-gatherer raised on the northern coast, the farming villages of Denmark would have been utterly alien. The permanent houses that didn't move, the fields of cultivated plants, all of one species growing together, the domesticated animals that didn't flee from humans, the stored grain in large quantities, the pottery for storage, the sedentary lifestyle, the larger population densities, the social hierarchies. All of it would have been strange, possibly disturbing, fundamentally different from everything he had known in his childhood. And yet somehow Vittrup Man crossed this divide. Somehow he left the world of hunters and entered the world of farmers. Somehow he adapted well enough to survive for years, possibly decades. This alone makes his story remarkable. The fact that his life ended in violence makes it a mystery. The fact that modern science can reconstruct his journey in such detail makes it unprecedented. The journey alone would have been extraordinary. From the coastal regions of northern Scandinavia to Denmark is roughly 800 miles. In 3300 BC, there were no roads, no maps, no modern navigation tools, but both cultures were sophisticated seafarers. They built seaworthy vessels capable of navigating the open ocean and the frigid coastal waters. Vittrup Man almost certainly travelled by boat, a long, dangerous journey across the North Sea or around the Scandinavian coast. Multiple days of sailing through unpredictable waters. This wasn't a casual trip. This was a major expedition. But why would he make this journey? This is where the mystery deepens. This is where we enter the realm of competing theories, each with its own evidence, each with its own implications. Theory 1, he was a trader, someone who served as a merchant or middleman between the two cultures. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of trade between Danish farmers and Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. Those high-quality flint axes didn't transport themselves to Norway. Someone was facilitating these exchanges, someone who could navigate both worlds, someone who understood both cultures. Perhaps Vittrup Man was chosen for this role when he came of age. Perhaps his entire adult life was dedicated to maintaining these connections, living among the farmers but maintaining ties to his original people. Theory 2, he was captured, enslaved, the darker possibility. The Neolithic period in Scandinavia saw numerous social groups coexisting in close proximity, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. Raids were not uncommon, captives were taken, and the final act of Vittrup Man's life, his brutal death and deposition in a bog, fits patterns associated with ritual sacrifice. Throughout the Neolithic and into the Iron Age, northern European cultures sometimes sacrificed people in bogs. Often these were young adults, often they died violently. And some researchers have suggested that slaves or captives were particularly likely to be chosen for these rituals. Christian Christiansen, one of the archaeologists on the research team, favours this interpretation. He speculates that Vittrup Man may have been brought to Denmark as a captive, perhaps to work in the intensive labour of flint mining or agriculture. Perhaps he lived for years in this status, neither fully integrated into the community nor able to return home. And when he was no longer useful, when age or injury made him unable to work, he was sacrificed to the gods. Theory 3. He was a willing immigrant, someone who chose to leave his hunter-gatherer culture and join the farming society. Perhaps he was drawn by the promise of a different life. Perhaps he married into a farming family. Perhaps he was simply curious about these people, with their permanent villages and their domesticated animals, and their strange new ways. Perhaps he spent his adolescence learning about farming during visits or trading expeditions, and eventually decided to stay permanently. Each theory has merit. Each theory fits some of the evidence, but none can be proven with certainty. What we do know is what happened to his body and his life after he arrived in Denmark. The isotopic analysis of his bones shows that he lived in the farming community for 10 to 20 years. This wasn't a brief visit, this was a substantial portion of his adult life. During this time, his diet was typical of Neolithic Danish farmers. He ate cereals, bread made from cultivated grains, dairy products from sheep and goats, meat from domesticated animals. The protein fragments preserved in his tartar confirm this. Sheep or goat proteins, evidence of a farming diet. He had darker skin than the local Danish population, a physical marker of his different ancestry. He probably looked different, spoke differently. His entire childhood would have been shaped by a culture utterly foreign to the farmers he now lived among. Yet for years, maybe decades, he lived in this community. He ate their food, he participated in their economy, he existed in this world that was so different from everything he had known as a child. And then sometime between 3300 and 3100 BC, when he was between 30 and 40 years old, someone decided he had to die. The violence was extreme. This was not an accident. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a crime of passion. The forensic analysis of his skull fragments reveals the systematic nature of his murder. At least 8 blows. Heavy impacts from a blunt object with a rounded surface. Each blow fractured the skull. Each blow was delivered with significant force. Each blow was aimed at the head, the most lethal target. There are no defensive wounds on his other bones, no signs that he tried to block the blows, no evidence of a struggle. This suggests he may have been restrained, or unconscious from the first blow, or possibly willing. Some sacrificial victims in ancient cultures accepted their fate, believing they were being sent to serve the gods. The weapon was found with him. A maple wood club, its current length about 11 inches after part of the shaft broke away over the millennia. This club was deliberately placed in the bog alongside his remains. This was not discarded evidence. This was part of the ritual. Also found with his body, cow bones, a ceramic vessel. These weren't random items. These were offerings. This was a ritual deposit. The location itself was significant. Wetlands held a special place in the religious life of Northern Europe during this period. For thousands of years from the Neolithic through the Iron Age, people deposited valuable objects in bogs, neck rings of bronze and gold, weapons, pottery, agricultural tools. These were gifts to the gods placed in liminal spaces that existed between the solid earth and open water. Bogs were mysterious places. Their mix of gases could spontaneously combust, creating eerie lights in the darkness. They existed between categories, neither land nor lake. They were seen as gateways, portals to the other world, places where the barrier between the human realm and the realm of the gods grew thin. And it was into this sacred space that Vittrup Man's broken body was placed. But why? Why him? After years or decades of living in this community, after all that time adapting to their ways, eating their food, participating in their world, why was he chosen for this violent end? This is the question that haunts Aini researchers. This is the mystery that even the most advanced forensic technology cannot fully answer. One possibility is that he was always different, always an outsider. His darker skin, his foreign accent, his hunter-gatherer origins would have marked him as other. Perhaps he was tolerated in life, but never truly accepted. Perhaps when the community needed a sacrifice, when their crops failed or their animals sickened or their gods demanded appeasement, they chose the outsider. The foreigner, the one who wasn't really one of them. Another possibility is more practical and more brutal. If he was indeed a slave, his death may have been purely utilitarian. When he grew too old or too injured to work, he was no longer economically valuable, but he could still serve one final purpose. His death could sanctify the bog. His body could be an offering. His life could buy favour with the gods. Or perhaps it was more specific. Perhaps he transgressed some cultural boundary. Perhaps he violated a taboo that we don't understand. Perhaps he saw something he shouldn't have seen, or said something that couldn't be forgiven, or refused something that couldn't be refused. The deliberate, systematic nature of the killing suggests planning. This wasn't spontaneous violence. This was organised. Multiple people would have been involved. Someone to restrain him, someone to deliver the blows, someone to transport the body to the bog, someone to perform the ritual deposit. This was a community event, a public act. Others watched, others participated, others knew. And then, for more than 5,000 years, no one remembered. What makes Vittrup Man's story so powerful is not just the violence of his death, but the completeness of his life that scientists have been able to reconstruct. Never before have researchers been able to trace an individual's geographical and dietary life history in such detail from such a distant past. We can see him as a child on the cold northern coast, eating fish and seal meat, speaking a language now lost to time, learning the skills of hunting and boat building from his parents and elders. We can watch him as a teenager, perhaps making his first trading voyage south, tasting freshwater fish and wild game, beginning the transition away from pure maritime subsistence. We can follow him as a young man arriving in Denmark, encountering these farmers with their strange settled villages and domesticated animals and cultivated fields. We can track his dietary shift as he learns to eat bread and milk and mutton, as he adapts to agricultural rhythms, so different from the seasonal hunting patterns he grew up with. We can calculate the years he spent there, 10 to 20 years of his adult life, probably the majority of his life after childhood. We can imagine him working in the fields, perhaps, or helping with the animals, or continuing to trade, maintaining connections between his birth culture and his adopted one. And we can see the brutal end, the broken skull, the sacred bog, the ritual deposit, the silence of millennia. His story illuminates a moment of profound transition in human history. The shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture was not a simple, peaceful process. It involved collision of cultures, movement of peoples, genetic mixing, economic transformation, social upheaval, violence. Vittrup Man lived at the boundary of this transition. He crossed from one world to another. He embodied both the old ways and the new. He was a bridge between cultures separated by thousands of years of different development, and he paid for it with his life. Modern technology continues to reveal new details. In recent years, researchers have mapped the complete genomic history of prehistoric Nordic populations. They've analysed hundreds of teeth and bone fragments. They've tracked the movement of peoples across landscapes. They've reconstructed diets and diseases and migration patterns with unprecedented precision. But all this technology, all this knowledge, all this sophisticated analysis still leaves us with fundamental mysteries. We can say with confidence where Vittrup Man came from and how his diet changed and the chemical composition of the water he drank as a child. We can identify the proteins in his tartar and the strontium in his teeth and the fracture patterns on his skull. But we cannot know his thoughts. We cannot hear his voice. We cannot understand his dreams or his fears or his hopes. We cannot know if he came to Denmark willingly or as a captive. We cannot know if he was homesick for the northern coast or if he embraced his new life among the farmers. We cannot know if he loved anyone or if anyone loved him. We cannot know if he died believing he was serving the gods or if he died cursing his killers. The human element, the consciousness, the subjective experience of this individual life remains forever beyond our reach. What we can know is that his life mattered, that he was real, that he made a journey that would have been extraordinary in any era, that he adapted to circumstances that would challenge anyone, that he survived in a foreign land for years or decades, that his death was witnessed and ritualized and recorded after a fashion in the archaeological record. And we can know that 5,000 years later, his story still has power. It still raises questions. It still challenges our assumptions about how cultures interact, how people adapt, how violence operates in human societies, how the sacred and the profane intersect. The bog bodies of northern Europe are windows into worlds that would otherwise remain completely invisible. These are not kings or queens whose names were recorded in royal chronicles. These are not warriors whose deeds were celebrated in epic poems. These are ordinary people, or perhaps extraordinary people, whose only immortality comes from the peculiar chemistry of peat bogs and the determination of modern researchers to tell their stories. Vittrup Man is now displayed at the Vendsyssel Historical Museum in Denmark. His fragmented skull rests in a case where visitors can see the same bones that lay in darkness for 5 millennia. The maple club that killed him is preserved nearby. The ceramic pot and cow bones that accompanied him into the bog have been catalogued and stored. But the real monument to his life is not in a museum. It's in the scientific literature, in the detailed papers that map his journey from the northern coast to a Danish bog, in the genetic sequences that connect him to vanished populations, in the isotopic analyses that reveal his dietary transformations, in the forensic examination of his shattered skull. These studies have made him more than just another ancient skeleton. They've made him an individual. They've given him a biography. They've brought him back to life, in a sense, through the power of modern science to reconstruct vanished lives. His story has implications that extend far beyond one violent death in prehistoric Denmark. It tells us about migration and cultural contact, about the difficulties of crossing boundaries between different societies, about how people adapt or fail to adapt when transplanted to new cultures, about the violence that can accompany cultural transitions, about the role of sacrifice in ancient religions, about how communities define insiders and outsiders. These are not just ancient problems, these are human problems. Migration, cultural collision, violence against outsiders, the search for belonging, the price of difference. These themes resonate across all of human history, including our own time. Every time researchers discover another bog body, every time they apply new technology to old bones, every time they reconstruct another ancient life, we learn more about the human condition, about how our ancestors lived and died, about how societies formed and changed, about the constants and variables in human nature. Vittrup Man's violent death was a tragedy, but his preservation, his eventual discovery, and the scientific investigation of his remains have turned that tragedy into knowledge, into understanding, into a story that connects us across 5,000 years, to a man whose name we'll never know, but whose life we can now glimpse. The questions that remain unanswered are perhaps as valuable as the answers we've found. They remind us of the limits of knowledge. They humble us. They keep the mystery alive. They ensure that Vittrup Man remains not just data, but a human being, complex and unknowable in the ways that all humans are ultimately unknowable. We cannot bring him back. We cannot undo the violence. We cannot give him justice or vindication or peace. What we can do is remember him. We can tell his story. We can honor his life by trying to understand it as completely as possible. We can let his experience illuminate our understanding of the past. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's all we can ever do for the dead. Remember them, study them, tell their stories, keep them from being forgotten. Vittrup Man was killed more than 5,000 years ago in a ritual that has been lost to time. His bones were scattered in a bog, hidden in darkness, forgotten by history. But science has brought him back into the light. Not as a victim, not as a statistic, but as a person, as an immigrant, as a survivor, as someone whose life spanned two worlds and ended in violence. His story is complete as far as the evidence allows, from birth on a northern coast to death in a Danish bog, from maritime hunter-gatherer to agricultural labourer, from childhood in one culture to adulthood in another, from life to violent death to 5 millennia of darkness, to resurrection, through science. But the deepest questions remain mysteries, and perhaps they always will. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some things should remain unknown. Perhaps the limit of our knowledge is a kind of respect for the irreducible humanity of people who lived and died long before writing, before records, before anyone thought to preserve their stories. What we know about Vittrup Man is extraordinary. What we don't know is humbling. And in that gap between knowledge and mystery, in that space where science meets imagination, his story lives. A story of migration and violence, of survival and sacrifice, of one man's journey across cultures and across seas, and finally into a bog that would preserve his bones long enough for us to find them and wonder about his life. He is Denmark's oldest confirmed immigrant, Europe's most thoroughly studied Neolithic bog body, a bridge between hunter-gatherers and farmers, a victim of violence, a subject of ritual, a window into a vanished world. He is Vittrup Man. And though he died more than 5,000 years ago, his story is still being told.